Hey, okay, there's some people back. All right. I'm still not getting it on the Cedar Lane website. Here we go. Nope. Yes. No. An error occurred. Let me try one more time.
An error occurred.
That's what it said. There we go.
Okay, there's some people back.
All right. Sorry about that, everybody. That
You
was
got
my fault. Was kind of swooping in here. Rylan actually beat me to my own house. I stopped and got dinner on the way back from Sadler Duncan's baptism, which we're grateful
All
to
right.
celebrate with Sadler and the Duncans, and know that their whole family is excited about that. And I am too. I'm glad for Sadler, and we're grateful for the Duncan family.
Hey, Dave and Celia.
David Zillion, how you doing? We had senior Zoom today.
Yeah, that's always a
so
blast.
I feel like I was
I've
sitting
heard.
here with them just a moment ago. But we've restarted everything. And a lot has happened since then. It seems like in just a few short hours. So tonight, okay, I want us to talk a little bit about Alexander Campbell. Okay, and Alexander Campbell, for people of our movement, we're from the Churches of Christ, and he's a towering figure. Okay, he is just an incredible figure in the story of our people, and really, honestly, the religious culture of our country, really the culture of our country, if we want to put it that way. He was a very well known figure in is that RH is here now. RH loves himself some Alexander Campbell. So RH,
right.
if you want to jump in on something, you just let us know.
Yeah,
We'd
say
love to
some
hear
stuff
those
in the
comments chiming in.
And then you see that Will McMichael?
Will, okay, so Will's got some prayer requests too, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh man, wow, that's some pretty significant stuff. That is, we will pray for your father. Will, for those of you guys that are on the YouTube channel, I don't see those comments. Will's father has relapsed into some addiction issues, and that is heartbreaking. Okay, Will, and so we'll tell you what. Let's go ahead and pray for that, and then we'll come back to the other subjects of this class here in just a moment. God, it is heartbreaking when addictions oppress people. And when we fall prey to those choices that lead us into them, and especially when we've come out and we go back to that, it's very heartbreaking for people that love those who are oppressed by addiction. And so we pray for Will, and we pray for his father, and we pray for all those in that circle, and we pray for release from that. We pray that he would do the sorts of things that can help him be released from that addiction. And we pray for the healing of the wounds that such a thing causes to. In Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for sharing that, Will. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
That is heartbreaking. So let's talk about this guy. Let's talk about Alex. Nobody calls him Alex.
Alex.
I don't think they did that.
Al?
I've never heard anybody call him Al Campbell.
Al Campbell?
Yeah, never heard anybody refer to him as that.
Heard it here first.
Yeah. Also, Bart Stone instead of Barton.
Bart.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've never heard Bart or Al come out of anybody's mouth in referring to the adventures of these two. When we talk about, we've already done a lot of work in setting the stage, but we did more of that on the European side. We talked about the U.S. part of this a little bit last week, but the thing to understand about that you have to understand in terms of the culture into which the Campbells came. Not just in the intellectual tradition, but in terms of the religious culture of the day. It is absolutely a part of the American Great Awakenings, okay? Which were, there's two of them. We think about two different Great Awakening movements. One that happens in the 1730s to 40s, sometime in that range, or 20s through 40s, and 35 or so, 37, about peak time.
Is that more in Europe, or is it you're talking about U.S.?
That's in the U.S. There was a movement in Britain that was similar to, okay, but this is the American one is the one that we refer to as the Great Awakening, and it the British version yielded things like the Wesleys, okay, the Wesleyan brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who were founders of Methodism. Okay, that kind of comes out of that same time frame in the parallel movement that's happening in Britain. But then those ideas come to the U.S. too, and then very importantly, they go to the far west, okay, the western frontier, which in those days was like Ohio,
Yeah.
Kentucky,
The Midwest,
Tennessee, yeah,
or even the East.
yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And in those frontiers, okay, we start having the development. We just have this kind of weird mix of soup that brings about this what will be called like American revivalism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and some of the elements of this are things like that these churches in the frontier were like further and further apart from urban settlements. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so you get out there and the kind of established churches, they can't just have like a minister at every small little
Mm-hmm.
outpost settlement in western Kentucky or wherever.
So is this where you get like
Eastern
the
Kentucky.
traveling minister?
Yeah, that's
that rides
right.
around on his
That's
horse
exactly
and you see him
right.
once a month or something.
You start getting that kind of stuff a little bit, and then part of that is because of the way like religious culture was in that day. It was expected that it would be an ordained minister that would conduct the sacraments. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so things like baptism or the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. Like a layperson wasn't allowed to give those. You couldn't just have like a casual Lord's Supper
So
thing.
you couldn't do it once a week even if you wanted
No.
to.
That's right. That's exactly right, and that's an issue. And so part of what happens as a response to that is you have these things where they would say, "Hey, we're going to be there on the second Sunday of the month in October. Gather all," and so people would come from miles around. They would come to like celebrate communion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you would have the same thing like these preaching. You had this kind of emerging of preaching superstars who would conduct these revivals. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a wave of this in the mid 1700s. Okay, and another thing that's contributing to that too is like the frontier is. Like, you just think about this, right? Like, we're out there for 2 months, kind of living on our own, grace at the table, but nothing like, and then this priest comes and he offers
Yeah.
like, and then he goes away and we're not seeing him for another couple of months.
Do you assemble in between when the preacher comes at all?
Some are,
Okay.
there is some of that, but not necessarily, right? I mean, especially when you're talking about places that are like really far flung, okay? And so part of what's happening is you have this kind of collision. There's this super collision of like a very structured church organization that's controlled from the clergy. Okay, you have a collision of that with like American frontierism, and it's like the rugged. We're out here cutting logs to make ourselves a house, and we don't need those folks.
Yeah.
You know what? We don't need those. And the
so you're getting more individualism in there too. Like
Yeah.
we don't need a community to rely on. We can do this.
well, we
ourselves.
definitely not just community. We don't need an authority to rely.
Authority. Maybe that was a better word.
Yeah. Now the community stuff is interestingly part of that too. I don't think that's wrong. Okay, but I think there's less of that. Okay, in fact, because in some ways these people, when they would gather together, they kind of prize the rarity of their fellowship with each other, it seems like, but they don't prize the dude from back east telling us what to do. That's we're
he doesn't know what
that.
it's like to live out here. How can he tell us what to do?
Exactly. Okay, so there's that kind of collision is a big deal in setting the stage. Okay, and this whole like form of like revivalism that emerged led to like these just much more like the worship gatherings that would come that were a part of this. They weren't as formally structured. They just weren't. Okay, and so you had more emotional preaching. You had longer improvisational kind of sermons. Okay, rather than the clergyman with a collar coming and giving a very orderly, reasoned manuscript, homily. You have passionate preachers trying to convince you to give your life to God in a very different sort of way. Okay, and all that's in the mid 1700s. When we're going to get at the beginning of the New Republic, okay, there's enthusiasm about the new country. There's expansion into these what are seen as like unsettled lands. Okay, and so it seems like the beginning of a new world, right? It seems like everything's started fresh, and so
that's biblical, right?
yeah, I mean, it very much thinks that way, right? And so you have this kind of the pump is really primed for people to say we're kind of dealing with something that we're making from scratch, okay? And it makes sense to them. There's a real natural leap to say, well, let's rethink the ways that we've been doing this religious stuff too. Okay, all right. All that to say, that kind of sets the stage for this particular father-son duo that are going to come from Ireland and Scotland. Okay, they're Irish but educated in Scotland, and they make their way to the new. They make their way to the U.S. And they actually, the intention was for Thomas to come early and kind of get the place ready, and then they would come shortly. Thomas is the father. Thomas is the father. And he does. He leaves, comes to the U.S. Okay. Alexander has begun studying. This is 1806. Okay. Alexander is a young man. He's gone to get his education at the University of Glasgow to become a minister himself. But he and the rest of the family are going to come second. Right? And then there's this. This is really a dramatic story. This is I think a lot of people would love to know this kind of like adventure story that happens here. Because what takes place is Thomas goes to the New World. He goes to the Americas, 1800s. I mean, New World language is probably not appropriate.
Anymore.
Yeah,
it's more like
the colony. It's the U.S. I mean, it's 1806. And when he goes to Scotland or when he comes to the U.S., he begins to have questions about all the what he perceives as kind of the pettiness of the divisive culture, and particularly some things like there are particular like spiritual issues about the Bible that he has questions about, like whether they're really scriptural or not. Okay, like he's already thinking at that point. He's already thinking about like infant baptism and some stuff like that. Thomas is. Meanwhile, okay, and so he actually at one point actually withdraws his old Presbyterian affiliation and begins worshiping with some Baptist, more looser, I guess, congregational forms of worship, of church. But the problem is he is nervous as a cat about that because he recognizes that he's going to have to like explain all this to his family, and including like his new minister son, who
are Presbyterians. I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, and that's like a very common form of the Reformation in Scotland. Is Presbyterianism in Scotland? Okay. Really, that's just the Church of Scotland is generally filled with a lot of Presbyterianism. But we'll talk about some of that in a minute.
Okay.
Some of that structure. Meanwhile, Alexander on the other side of the Atlantic, he actually has an experience that's very similar, and he comes to this place where he is has himself decided that he doesn't want there's this moment where he kind of refuses to go through some of the creedal stuff in distinguishing that he's part of the church that that he has to say, and he's kind of walking away from it too. Okay, and they're both kind of in angst over this.
So he's worried what his dad's going to think.
Yeah, very much so, right? Like, I mean, you can imagine that, right? He's about to make this like ocean voyage. They end up being delayed. The family ends up being delayed. I think there's like a shipwreck. Okay. And so they end up being delayed for like another. Yeah, right. I mean, it really is kind of like this adventure story, right? And they end up having to wait like a whole year longer or something like that to come. And they finally come and they greet each other and of course, glad to be reunited and all that kind of stuff. And then they begin to like confess to each other that they've taken this departure, only to find out that they're really much closer on the same page. It's really, really neat story. It also speaks to the angst that they had about feeling like they were leaving something that had been dear to them. And so that's a part of the story. The Campbells they eventually settle in, Alexander and his wife, he's not married when he comes, they marry soon. He marries a woman that has some property, and they eventually settle over they're in kind of like the Pennsylvania, North Virginia. Where they end up settling is in West Virginia, but it's not at the time, right? This is like before North Virginia, West Virginia is the thing.
Yeah.
And so they're in the in what will become Northern West Virginia, and but in that kind of region, it's very much frontier sort of region. Yeah. And over the next several years, they're just kind of begin to evolve very quickly into having something like a different movement. In between when he comes in 1807, Alexander comes in 1807, I think. Pretty sure that's right. In 1812, he's gotten married, and they have their first child. Okay? And they've already begun withdrawing from these other organizations and kind of beginning to do some of their own thing. They have some affiliation with some Baptist groups, okay? But they don't necessarily identify as Anabaptist yet or anything like that.
So, do they have a congregation, or are they traveling around preaching? Or what do you mean when you say withdraw?
They begin worshiping independently. They're already worshiping independently.
But like with their families?
No, with other people from the church that made the same decision. So they kind of have a church split.
Okay.
All right. So what would you get? All right. So Alexander is born in 1788. Okay. So by the time we get to 1812, he's a 24-year-old youngly married thing. So this is when he has his serious crisis about the nature of baptism. Would you like to guess, Ryland Cox, from your wealth of experience information, what do you think? Let's see. A. Campbell arrives in 1809. Oh, that's Alexander. So Thomas leaves in 1807, and then it's 1809.
2 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for clarifying that, RH. I need you to be on the spot. I say it could be. It looks like it's Peggy.
It's probably Peggy.
I'm assuming it was RH because I know how much he loves Alexander Campbell. But
Peggy likes Alexander.
We'll give
Campbell
Peggy the credit for that. Yeah.
Hamilton. Your own
Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Campbell.
Campbell.
Yeah.
I've been thinking that in my head the whole time. Like, nope, it's not Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton dies somewhere around this time. It's pretty close to the time where he does. Okay, so here's where we're at. This is when the stage set. What do you think led to his wrestling about the nature of baptism? What would you guess?
About infant baptism.
Yes.
Like his child?
That's right.
Being born?
He has a daughter.
Okay.
Yeah. He's 24-year-old dude.
I was confused because I thought that he was struggling before he came over.
Well, Thomas had already. Thomas had already.
But that wasn't one of the things he was thinking about before.
Not before he came over. Yeah, when he comes over, I mean, that's starting. I mean, obviously he's aware of that because the Anabaptist movement is already around. Okay.
Yeah.
But his real struggle with it comes in 1812. By the time he's kind of finished with that, he decides, no, I think he believes in believer baptism, right? Mm-hmm. Where someone should come to an age in faith and come to faith as they come to decide for themselves to be baptized. And so he comes to that place for himself, and he says, hey, if I'm not going to baptize he first says, well, I'm not going to baptize my daughter. I'm not going to sprinkle her like I was sprinkled. And then he says, well, if that's true, if I'm not going to do it for her, then I have to think my own baptism is questionable. And so, and this is a problem because he can't baptize himself. And so he has to ask around until because this is unusual, right? Yeah. You're usually baptized within the tradition that you don't have anything like that. And he finds a.
What about his dad?
His dad hasn't been baptized either.
So they can't. They don't think that they can baptize each other because they
You know
haven't
what?
been
That is
baptized yet.
yes, that's exactly right. That's the problem. Although I actually saw one time I was at a place where two people did baptize each other, and I thought it
At
was
the
so
same
strange.
time?
And I understand the tradition when we baptize
Yeah.
somebody, it is the church that baptizes them, and so
Yeah.
there is something to this, but.
Well, so they had to find like an Anabaptist or
So a Baptist, yeah, they found a
Baptist.
Baptist minister. I think his name's Luce, Luce.
I just would like
I feel like it's Matthias maybe or something like that.
at some point there, for this logic to play out,
Somebody has to be first.
you have to have someone who baptized you that was baptized, that baptized them, that baptized them.
That's right.
Otherwise, it just breaks apart at wherever that first person wasn't baptized as a
Yeah.
believer.
But they find. I mean, they do, and
Okay.
so they are baptized. Alexander and his wife and his father and mother are all baptized here at the same
Okay.
time, and I think some other people within their association are baptized as well, and so this would be a decent time to kind of think. I mean, they're beginning the movement here. Okay.
Mhm.
Alexander, within a few short years, is himself ordained, by his father. He's kind of deemed a minister.
Okay.
Even though they're beginning to push back on that whole language and process, it's really funny. They're coming in bits and pieces here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What they really gravitate towards ends up being kind of a combination of Baptist and Presbyterian traditions in lots of ways. The Presbyterian Church comes from a strong Reformed background. And in its very name is, the Presbyterian, that name comes from how it's organized as a church. Okay? Presbyter is the word for elder or bishop in the Greek, and it comes from that Greek word. And so Presbyterian churches are congregational. They have some independence, and they are.
You have eldership?
Yeah, they have like an eldership.
Okay.
Yeah, they have like a governing board of presbyters
For each church.
Yes, there are other structures as well, but yeah, the congregation has a group of presbyters. Yeah. Okay. And now they refer to that as the session. That's like Presbyterian church. You talk to Presbyterian church now, you say you went to a session meeting. That would be like our elder meetings.
Our elder, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And when I first I went to Presbyterian school for my doctorate, and at first I was like, I don't even know what these people are talking about. Like, what's the
Session
session?
of what?
The session of what? Yeah. Session of the elders.
Okay.
Presbyters. Yeah. But they refer to it as this. They talk about the session as like the collective body of.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where that language comes from, but anyway. And I don't know that it goes all the way back to that far either. I've never seen that language in early Campbell stuff. They take that structure, and then some of the Baptist things about, like, obviously baptism. Okay, the baptism line is kind of the biggest dividing mark between the Baptists and the Presbyterians. Okay, and also just kind of their Calvinist, like the Presbyterian tradition is more Calvinist kind of in some of its thinking too.
Are the Baptists back then kind of similar to Baptists that we would think of today? I know there's a lot of different Baptist traditions, so I'm not sure.
In some ways,
they're all
I
the
think in
same,
some
but-
ways, I would say, yeah. I think largely, the Baptist tradition is being sharply formed. It's kind of the mashup of the old Anabaptist traditions and that American revivalism kind of stuff. Okay, so in the American revivalist movements, the Baptists are probably the most deeply formed by that. Now, the American Methodism kind of comes along for the ride too, and kind of finds its own thing as well. But the Baptists really like go for it. Like they're like, oh yeah, this revivalism thing is the way.
Yeah,
that's And when we think about like typical Baptist worship forms, like we're really thinking about revivalist forms that have kind of been domesticated somewhat. And our own too. We should say that's true for ours too. Like what we typically do in worship, as distinguished from a lot of our other faith traditions, is very heavily influenced by that kind of revivalist stuff. Okay. here's we talk about him. Okay, let's talk about some kind of the nature of Alexander, and just kind of talk about what kind of a cat he was. He was very cerebral. Okay, like in completely devoted to a rational pursuit of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say it was heartless. Okay, he is a feeling guy too. Okay, but he is a guy that can think his way into or out of anything. I mean, he has a brilliant logical mind. All right. And so the kind of Lockean stuff that we talked about before, the Enlightenment kind of just give me the facts kind of thing. Like Alexander Campbell is brilliant at kind of parsing out. Like that's his main mode of thought. In some ways, to the detriment of the movement, because he's so good at that his like mental train of thought just overpowers anything in its way. I mean, he can kind of like logically pretty much bulldoze through anything, right? And he was able to do that on something. I mean, he was also passionate. I mean, he's a passionate person too. I really don't want to. I think sometimes he's portrayed too much as being so rational that he's almost like cold and heartless. And I just don't think that's it.
Yeah. Did he write a lot? I know Locke wrote a lot. A lot of these guys
that's a great question.
Write a lot of books and stuff.
So yes is the answer, but not in the way that you might think. Okay, he was like a blogger. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he wrote in 1823. Mm-hmm. He bought a printing press. He bought his own printing press. Okay, and he began sending out a newsletter that he called a newspaper. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's called the Christian Baptist. Okay. Now, eventually, in about 7 or 8 years, he's going to like change the name of that, and because he's like they've kind of become a little bit more separated out from the Baptist in some ways. Okay, so he's gonna change that name to what's called the Millennial Harbinger. All right,
I've heard of that.
The Millennial Harbinger, Okay, so if you go into art, no, it's not a thing anymore. It goes up into. I think some form of it actually may have carried on after his death, but he kind of later in his life, he eventually stopped spending as much energy in it, even though he continues publishing it. We have, I think, so if you go into our library, church library, you would see that there's like 7 or 8 volumes of the Christian Baptist, okay, and then there's like another 20 of the Millennial Harbinger. Okay. So I mean, this is like a full shelf and a half of in our church library. I mean, it's a there's a lot of books, okay, but in terms of books, he only wrote a handful. He wrote one called The Christian System. He did like a translation of the New Testament, I think, called The Living Oracles, okay, which he included some notes on, along the way too. And then he published a couple of other things, and then there were some of his arguments and like lectures and sermons were published as well. But the answer is yes, he wrote a lot, okay? But if you look at if you open up the Millennial Harbinger, and by the way, again, like we said with the Declaration... Did you read the Declaration and Address from Thomas Campbell?
No.
Come on, man. I know that all of you did. Mm-hmm. You did, right? Okay. All right, so if you go and flip through...
Yeah.
Yes.
RH.
Yeah,
that's the 40 volumes.
Yes.
So that proves that it was Peggy before.
He also said that it was already. He must have cleared up.
Initials after it. So.
Thanks. Appreciate that, RH. Yeah. If you go through and if you look at the Millennial Harbinger, okay, you would find it has this. It's like the newspaper version of like a call-in show. Okay. Because people would write in letters. People write letters with questions, and he would respond to those. There might be a table of like weird facts, Abby. Like almanac kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's. I mean, it's not so random as like the almanac where this is planting your corn or whatever. But but it is. It's more than just like Alexander Campbell's thoughts. It's not like he just mailed everybody a sermon of the month or something like that. I don't know how. I don't know how often it was, but I want to think it was like every couple of weeks or once a month, something like that. Anyway, no, it's definitely actually it's probably more than that. It may very well have been weekly.
Okay. Is there like devotionals in there and things? Or
I wouldn't say devotionals, but a lot of times it'll start with like an article. It'll start with some main article, and then it'll have some like. And he was very generous. And this is what I mean. It's kind of hard to say like how much he wrote, right? Because it's not all his writing. Like sometimes he'll invite somebody that has a problem with something he said, and he'll invite them to send in a review. I mean, he's actually very generous with the people that he publishes. Okay. And so there are people that question him. So his real role is that of an editor. Okay, in this. I mean, you gotta think too. This is he's 35 when he started this. Okay, but he recognizes very quickly there's value in getting this information to all this movement is kind of spread out all through the country and in these like frontier places, right? And he recognizes pretty quickly on, you know what, like. He can influence and shape this broader movement, that
So do you have to
he's
get
not
on-
going to be able to go all these places.
Yeah, but do you have to get on a mailing list? Like, how does he?
Yeah,
that
I
work?
mean, he's like sending all these things in the post, man.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of significant operation.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know. RH, you probably could look it up in the forward of one of those volumes, but I mean, it has like thousands of people that he's sending these things to, and they're not necessarily all to people that are part of his movement. Okay, like he is just sending them very wide. Look at this. Okay,
Monthly.
a monthly publication. Okay, that's close then. But I mean, it's significant. It's a significant.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot to write every
You
month.
think?
You
Yeah.
write a publication.
Yeah, and it's thicker. It's thicker than you would thought it was too. It's kind of like it's published in this kind of like newspaper sort of format.
Mhm.
Okay, but or pamphlet. It's kind of a cross between like newspaper and pamphletage in the way it comes out. But he can print it cheaply. We didn't talk about this, but this is like one of the innovations. The Gutenberg thing, movable type, had come up before, but like when we get to the Campbell place, it's the cheapness of the paper that actually makes it feasible. Okay, he can get choose cheap pulpy newspaper and publish this thing on.
Gotcha.
And that's like something that's happening broadly in his day. So that's like about like Thomas Paine, the Common Sense pamphlet stuff that was going on in the Revolution. Okay, like that's just kind of becoming an American cultural deal, like this newspaper culture. Okay. And so that he has this publication.
So if you want to say something, you want everyone to know, you just make a pamphlet.
Yeah. That's right. And to think and to have the brilliance that he's going to do this in a way that's going to disseminate it to this larger crowds. I mean, it's really kind of brilliant. Okay, and so he kind of takes into this this technological innovation. He buys into it in such a way to get his message off. And that's part of the reason he's so successful. Okay, is that he can communicate and have some unity between this movement that's really far flung on the frontier, and it's significant. He dies. Alexander Campbell is going to die in 1866. Okay. So given that,
Would you say he was born in 1870 something?
He's 1788.
No, 17.
1788. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
Yeah.
So he gets a good old age.
Yeah. Sure.
He lives
He
a
does.
long life.
Yeah, he's so he's what 78 when he dies, something like that. He given that if he dies in 1866, contextually speaking, what would you imagine was one of the great driving cultural forces of his late life?
It would be like Civil War stuff, like
That's
slavery.
right. That's right.
Maybe?
Yeah, and he ends up being a really unusual voice in all that. Okay? Now, if you read... Now, here's the thing, right? Another thing about Alexander Campbell that is really significant is that between 1823 and 66, okay, you're talking about like 43 years. That's probably about right for the Harbinger. Since his major publishing format is in this newspaper form, he says all kinds of different stuff about everything. Okay, and he's pretty candid and actually thinks very much prizes it as a virtue that he considers things anew. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you know what he says in 1825 might not be what he says in 1830, and it might not be what he says in 1855 and on in later. You know, I mean, he absolutely evolves, and it's very difficult. He kind of makes him a difficult man to study in some ways because he's a moving target. Okay, so he says things one here and it sounds different than he does here. You know, different stuff. He would not pass the test of like being a progressive thinker about slavery in the way that we think about it. Okay, because he says some things in terms of slavery that are like he's real stubborn at some points about refusing to say that it is always immoral, right? Because he's like, well, there is some slavery in the Bible. He doesn't distinguish the biblical slavery from like American chattel slavery. Mm-hmm. You know, so he has some shortcomings there, I think, which just aren't recognized, but culturally similar. But on the other hand, he had other times where he did think it was immoral and had obvious problems with it. Okay, he himself was briefly a slave owner. Okay, his when he married, I think this is when his first wife died, and when he married his second wife, he inherited slaves from her family, and he was personally against it enough that he freed them. Okay, and but then he had this other complicated position. Like before he freed them, he insisted on teaching them a trade. Okay, so he didn't just formally send them away. He and I think he materially provided for them somewhat. Okay, when he freed his slaves and when freed the enslaved persons and sent them, he trained them in he made sure that they were trained in some kind of craft and had some education before he did that, which I think is commendable. But when he enters into the public debate about it, like his plan, he offers this public plan where he advocates that the U.S. Treasury, which at this point is like in a surplus. What? A treasury with a surplus? No way. He advocates that they begin setting money aside every year so that in 3 or 4 years, basically that the federal government would have enough money in the bank to pay for the manumission of all slaves. Mm-hmm. And then his position gets kind of complicated because he argues for that, and he also argues for like educating them in tradesmanship before they leave, and he can say I've done this, you know. Mm-hmm. But at other places he's clearly concerned about whether American culture can embrace that enough, and so he also proposes like recolonization, okay, like sending enslaved persons back to Africa, you know, if that's what they want to do, like providing materially for them. He also very much advocates a wholesale change where like the plantation, like slave owners and plantation owners would be compensated for that labor that was being taken away from them, because he wanted to prevent the kind of economic collapse, which in fact does occur after the Civil War in the South in Reconstruction. So, you know, on some sides, like he says things that, you know, judged by today's standards, would absolutely be like, that's kind of racist, you know, because he appeals to the people making these decisions, and he's basically saying, look, as a white person, you should be in favor of this, my plan, and you should be in favor of moving away from slavery, because this stuff is going to, the bill is going to come to you, basically. Like, you know, there's going to be a reckoning for this, and the quicker we can get out of it, and the quicker we can get out of it in a way that's economically sustainable, okay? It's exactly the kind of plan that somebody who is like super rational would put forward, right? And it is heartbreaking to him, I think, I as far as I can tell. I think it is really heartbreaking to him that the country ends up, instead of coming to some rational solution that is I mean, you really get the feeling that Campbell is like really trying to figure out a win-win.
Yeah.
A win-win that ends up with the South not having slavery, but with everybody still being
Without a civil war.
Yeah, and also economic value.
So is Alexander Campbell at this point influential enough that like people in government would know about his plan and? Okay.
Yeah, and he actually has some roles. Like I think he sits on some Virginian council at some point. You know, I mean, he has some. Yes, this guy has clout. Okay. In 1840, he had founded a college, so he has a college where he's trained. Another thing I meant to say when we were talking about some of his earlier influence is there are a lot of people that come under him and basically come stay at their home and are heavily mentored, and that he'll go and travel and preach with them and take this, you know, and there's kind of this rotating cast of people that do that, and so it's not, and so then those people are like writing guest articles, you know, in the Millennial Harbinger. You can kind of see how this works, right? And so there's this kind of different effects that are leading to this broadening of the movement. So it's not just him, okay, but he has influence on all those other people too, right? So it's pretty significant kind of way that he continues to have influence, even though it's not just all under his. It's not all happening in his backyard. Okay?
Yeah.
And then he's like traveling and preaching too. I mean, he's doing all that, and, you know, alongside as well. But I really think it's safe to say that his primary influence was from the circulation of the Harbinger and the Christian Baptist, and then also through the people who he directly influenced himself. Okay? Let's see here. Yeah, we were just saying that, Jordan, I don't know if she may have said this right before we started that conversation.
Yeah. Maybe.
Jordan, his views on slavery, he actually at one point inherited slaves from his wife's family, which he trained in a craft and then freed, and with some provision. Okay, and he generally believed, as far as I can tell, like his mentality was to do that that he wanted to see the South move away from slavery, but he believed that the biggest obstacles to that were political and economic, and so he tried to argue for like the U.S. saving money to basically be able to pay for all that happening. You know.
And also, R.H. says he was elected to the Virginia Constitutional Convention in the 1820s. So that's kind of what you were talking about there.
Yeah. So he does have that kind of clout. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. You know, and he's absolutely known as like a leading intellectual. You know, too. He's very, very, very influential. So, you know, basically there's that. Now, one thing that we can see in Campbell is not entirely spared the tragedy of this, but in the wake of the Civil War, the movement that he and Stone and some of these other characters we're going to talk about in later weeks founds does suffer division, right? Mm-hmm. And so we said at the beginning, you know, the movement that we're a part of in the Churches of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, and the independent Christian churches, are generally understood to be kind of these prongs of that movement, and in the U.S. And there's going to be there's going to be this kind of splitting, this parting of the ways, and in some ways the stage was already being set for that even in Campbell's day. Okay, it's worth saying that in the run-up that covers Campbell's life, especially his active life and ministry in the U.S. from the early 1800s all the way through his death in 1866. It was a time of massive division. First of all, there's other religious movements like this, okay, that are kind of taken up. So there's a lot of religious division, but more importantly, like the cultural division of the country was significant. Totally different than nowadays. Okay. Good thing there's nothing like that happening.
Good thing we have no division.
Yeah, right. And part of what was happening in that time period is that many of the other religious denominations that were already in play had explicit divisions about race and slavery. Mm-hmm. Okay, whether that was these big denominational groups that would fracture into a northern and southern branch, okay, or whether that you're talking about the creation of racial like black denominate, like the AME Church, mm-hmm. that's founded in this time frame because they're not being admitted into white churches or not given full equality in those churches. So this is happening all over the place. All right. I do think Campbell's work is a contrast to that. Like he seems to very much be concerned that that freed and enslaved black people become Christians. He seems to desire that very much. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think we have to reckon and honestly say that in some ways he comes across as being fairly aloof from the plight of enslaved Africans. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, does he think? I don't know.
Well, it's part of his idealism. Remember, to say that there's this biblical stuff. This stuff is in the Bible, and so he says things like, "If I were a slave owner still, the only way that I could morally do that would be if I treated a slave in the same way that I would want to be treated if the tables were turned and I was the slave and the other man was the master." Okay? Which I think is pretty safe to say now in retrospect that what you would want is to be free. This slavery was a compulsion against the will of these people.
Yeah.
But that's part of his rational mind at work. Trying to make that, trying to really be clear, and he's very stubborn about Campbell. I mean, this is part of his thing, right? Like not trying to limit his claims to what can be easily defended from the Bible is like his driving force. Mm-hmm. Okay, and if it's not something that he can see in black and white in the Bible, he really resists commenting on it. Okay, mm-hmm. as a compulsion, like compelling people, you have to do this. Okay,
versus like his opinion, right. His personal.
So he's not going to come to the place where he is going to compel people, like say, the Bible demands that you free your slaves. He can't. Mm-hmm. He just can't make himself do that. Okay, but it does seem clear to me that he believes that it is an evil. Okay, and that's certainly the way that it is typically being practiced is not within the bounds of Christian charity. Okay, so there's that. All right, I think for somebody that's an influential leader during that time period, you think you have to have some kind of addressing of what's going on there. I do appreciate that. If nothing else, you can see that his own personal example was, I can't by conscience, mm-hmm. Pretend to be these people's master. I need to practice this freedom, give them the gift of freedom. Mm-hmm. Which, interestingly enough, by the way, was also something that the dude that we're going to talk about next week, who's Barton Stone, Barton Stone did that too. Barton Stone inherited, or had a slave, and felt compelled that he should again free him mm-hmm. and provide for him, and did that. So when it's unusual because looking back into our background, the two major founders both had that common experience, and yet I would stop short from saying they were abolitionists. Okay, although I say that one of Alexander Campbell's, he had family that was definitely like very clearly labeled abolitionist. Okay, like he had a nephew mm-hmm. That carried that, was a very vocal abolitionist, and had some other family ties like that too. So, at any rate, what happens as he kind of gets into the twilight of his life, and by the way, when he dies in 1966, I believe he's ill through most of 1965 as well. So he barely sees the end of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And he really is heartbroken by it. Okay,
Yeah.
I mean, very much heartbroken by the violence that comes in that war. And I think he just can't wrap his brain around this. Actually, like it's very clear that this is a huge human tragedy.
Yeah.
And I think he has a hard time wrapping his head around the fact that the U.S. had not been able to resist the draw of their passions and throwing them into that. You know. So, so that's tragic. But I will say that, like in the later part of his life too, I think he very clearly has taken solace in that there are people who are carrying on this work that he's put his life into. Okay. And that there are these other kind of groups of leaders that are emerging, very much emerging to takes place. So that's Alexander Campbell. You know, he's a very, very interesting person. He does make it for an interesting contrast with Barton Stone, who we'll talk about next week. Yeah. Sometimes they are, I think, a little too easily contrasted with each other in that, you know, Alexander Campbell is this intellectual and Barton Stone is this more impassioned, revivalist. I think that probably undersells both men, okay, who I think both burned with passion and both carried a pretty high level of intellectual rigor as well. As a caricature, it's probably too much, but I mean, it's there for a reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to know, at the end of Alexander Campbell's life,
yes,
did the church look anything like what it does now? Our church, our faith church, because I know that was before we split into 2 or 3 different groups, right? Mm-hmm. So there's some differences that came about because of that split. But
sure.
How close was it to what we know of?
There's probably less standardization. Okay, and by that I mean you probably have more diversity among the churches. Okay, remember one of the things that splits later is the practice of instrumental worship. Okay, that's one of the dividing lines, and like the presence of certain churches using instruments was already there. You know, by the time it grows for sure post Civil War.
So many questions.
Yeah.
How do you say, like, I'm in Alexander Campbell's church? Like, do you get the newsletter and then you're this church?
Well, they're calling themselves disciples.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, that's pretty. They're.
But are there
or Campbellites? A lot of people call them Campbellites. You ever heard that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes you still hear people say that. You know, Campbellite church, but like.
So there's this Presbyterian church, and then they're like, you know what, we like Alexander Campbell's stuff. Let's get his newsletter and start trying to do and have him preach here, and is that kind of
well, you don't have to. Or? Well, see, here's the thing, right? Like the whole point of it was you didn't have to buy into it wholesale.
Yeah. Okay.
Like you very much could have some things that I like that, like Campbell that thinks about that, and we've been doing that here too at our church. Yeah. You know, and
so there's not like the
I mean,
black and white.
That's the thing is he actually becomes. He becomes really resistant to being a gatekeeper. You can imagine that a lot of the letters that he gets are people asking him, "Well, is this person? Are they in or out?" You know, he's like, he almost always kind of hemming and hawing in there. He's usually pretty generous about saying that he would extend the hand of fellowship to somebody, or at least he would say more likely he would say, I wouldn't be willing to withdraw the hand of fellowship for something that. He's not explicitly commanded by God or something. In his language. That said, I don't know that... I think that's part of the point is that you have a diversity. And I think he would actually encourage that, okay? In that he really, really strongly believed in the independence of congregations and individual Christians to read the scriptures and make their own conclusions based on what their conscience... provokes them to as they read. I mean, he really believed
while keeping in unity with other Christians.
Yeah, certainly having some. I mean, he's expressing that commonality. Yeah. But I mean, there's times when his hand is forced. Like people ask him about things like baptism and stuff like that. But you almost always to me in reading stuff and I've by far not read the whole of the Millennium Prophet. I read good chunks of it here and then. You can always see that if it's somebody asking him to divide stuff up, he just hems and haws. He's like really reluctant to do that. But sometimes he kind of feels compelled to do it too. I don't know. I would tell you that the way that you probably knew is somebody else told you. Because that Campbellite designation was largely like pejorative. You know, it's other people would say, you're just a Campbellite, you know, kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
And you'd be like, well, yeah, I kind of do like it. I kind of agree with what I said.
Yeah.
But, you know, probably you had some kind of recognition of, or like a group of people that nobody would say, I follow Campbell's teachings. They would say, yeah, we find that we have in common with Campbell's teachings that we too want to follow the ancient path, you know, and, you know, have this restoration vision.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good way of saying it. So I don't know. That's why I talk about it more as a movement and less like a denomination or a church. Mm-hmm. You couldn't say, like what you said, like how would you know if you were part of his church? He would be like, I think he probably would have like taken his hat and thrown it, you know, burned the house down if he heard you say that. Because he would say, I don't have a church. Christ has a church. You know. Now there is this movement of people who are acknowledging that we find commonality with. That's a very Campbellish way of saying it. That we extend the hand of fellowship to, or something like that. But he wasn't interested in having the Alexander Campbell Church. He was interested in just seeing this movement of all the churches. And this often, again, this kind of worked in like a lot of times those were like wholesale conversions. Like he would go to a church and try to persuade like the whole church to do this, and often that's the way it happened. You know.
Okay. Yeah. So you'd be like a guest speaker.
Yeah.
They would say, "Hey, we've read your Millennial Harbinger or your
Aunt Susie here has been reading your newsletter and passing it around. We think you got some good things to say."
And then he would just orate, convince.
Yeah. He did some debate stuff too. He didn't love that as much as some others did, but he did have some kind of published debate stuff too. So they would go to a city and have like a big event, you know, where he was going to face off with somebody. But anyway,
sounds like fun.
All right, guys. Hey, next week we're going to talk about his counterpart, Barton Stone, who's a really, really interesting cat in his own way, and we'll kind of come to maybe have a little bit of understanding of the synthesis of this.
Was Barton Stone around the same time, or did he come after?
Yeah, he's actually a little bit earlier.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's actually a little bit earlier, beginning of the 1800s. Yeah.
All right.
So. Okay.
Thanks, RH.
All right. Hey, thank you guys. This was fun, interesting to talk to.
Yeah, it is.
He's interesting.
It's cool stuff.
He's an interesting dude. So, all right. We'll talk to y'all later.